All right, Danny, I got a question for you. Joe Biden or Spartacus? Which one of these two figures would you say is the ideal man?
That's a pretty hard thing to pick, but I guess depending on the day, I would have to go with either Joe Biden or Spartacus.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's kind of the point of the question. The truth is, defining the ideal man is a tricky thing to do. We might all have an image that comes to mind in our head of who we think the ideal man is, but the fact is, this image varies from person to person and culture to culture. I'm Solomon,
And I'm Danny.
and today we will be answering the question of whether or not the ideal man exists on our podcast. And the information we will be using is either sourced from or inspired by Professor Lalonde's Sex and Gender in Ancient Greece and Rome course. So huge shout out to her. And finally, we will be analyzing both the athletic and political arenas in order to answer this question.
All right, so it looks like we can get in this conversation, and let's start this conversation off with athletics, specifically Roman gladiators versus modern gladiators.
Oh, that's interesting. You're going to be drawing a comparison between those, like past and present?
Yep. So, firstly, let's talk about how society views this idea of the ancient versus modern gladiator. In ancient times, gladiators were used for a form of punishment for slaves or prisoners, and now it kind of seems like as if the idea of this NFL player is like a role model, and how you make it to the NFL, you make it big, you make a lot of money out of it.
Right. I mean, today guys like, I don't know, like Tyreek Hill are like setting the standard for kind of fashion, and their celebrations get emulated by teenage kids, and yeah, I see what you mean. They're kind of like almost heroes.
Yep, and also with Tyreek Hill, how like these NFL players are like fantasized over in like all aspects of their lives. You can see this through like their social media following, with like Patrick Mahomes having millions of followers on Instagram, and how Tom Brady gained his followers through like this idea of growing up, like climbing up the ladder in an aspect of going from like the 200th round pick in his draft class to winning 7 Super Bowls. And in ancient times, this idea wasn't really as popular. It was more rare because for a gladiator, you have to fight your way to stay alive, and each fight you win is more hype around your name for your owner, basically, to make more money off of you.
Right, but I mean, if you die, it's over.
Yeah,
So you don't have a lot of time to build your fame up.
And with that, it's literally one mistake and it's over for you. Gladiators, it was very risky business, and it kind of seems like today with like the Damar Hamlin situation in the NFL, nobody wants to see someone die on the field.
Right, no one even wants to see someone get hurt, really.
And with Damar Hamlin, our society has pushed towards to helping out Damar Hamlin rather than glorifying and being excited over one's death, like in gladiator fights when they would cheer from the Coliseum when there's a bloody death.
Right, okay.
And also, in ancient times, gladiators, for this idea of how gladiators became in fame, some gladiators used to sell their sweat to fans, to like the fandom, and this idea of sexualizing the gladiator.
Wow, it's kind of like the past, or I guess like drawing a comparison to the modern day bathwater craze.
Bathwater, and then also in an aspect, it's kind of like jersey sales, where the more fame a gladiator has, the more people want to get that sweat.
And it's like, yeah, the game worn jersey is like a big thing.
Jerseys, and how like gladiators didn't used to do this, but how players trade jerseys, because like more popular, more like veteran player usually tends to get asked to get traded the jerseys more often to the rookies or something like that. And also, for gladiators as a sex symbol, compared to like the sweat thing, gladiators were also a sex symbol and viewed as property to their owners, and essentially. An instance of this is Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, would use gladiators for lovers and essentially sex slaves in their work, and how she would sometimes interfere with the fight and interfere with the arena play to stop a fight to make sure her sex slave at the end of the day gets to come home and she can have sex with him, which is very fascinating because now it kind of seems like there's rare exceptions of this idea of the sexual relation between sport and like home life and like outside the arena. Gladiators, it wasn't like that though. Gladiators, it was straight. You fight. If you're good at fighting, you have sex a lot with a woman. Women are attracted to the gladiator, basically, and things like that. Now it's more of a profession where the whole cancel culture comes in, where like say an NFL player, or an NFL coach per se, like that Las Vegas coach a few years ago, John Gruden, who he got canceled so hard because of one email they said a few years back. That idea of how society tries to go away from the whole like you're bad, but instead it want to focus on the achievements and not like the bad part. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I definitely see what you're saying, and it's interesting because with the tying this back to the ideal man, it's like what am I trying to say here, man? I'm losing my words now. But I guess gladiators, like, here we go. While they were seen as, like you kind of said, like sex symbols and ideal, if they were winning a lot and they were good in the arena, they were still considered at the end of the day property, right? Whereas like today, I mean, you could be the worst NFL player in the entire league and just barely have a roster spot, but people will love you,
Yeah, and also with that ideal man aspect of it, gladiators were not the ideal man of their society. Gladiators were the complete opposite. People would look down upon gladiators and stuff like that. An instance for that is like someone like Spartacus, who now in today's world is viewed as an ideal man and as a hero because he led a slave rebellion against the empire, the Roman Empire. But during that time, Spartacus was viewed as a corrupt criminal for what he did, for his uprising, I guess, and like trying to put an end to how the society viewed gladiators and sex slaves and so on.
And now, I mean, he's one of the most famous gladiators, like, probably the one that everyone would know. So it's kind of interesting how that works out.
The movie Gladiator, the whole idea is the story of Spartacus, like, which is a very, very interesting part. But let's get more to the sexuality side of the NFL. Today's NFL, it doesn't really seem like sexuality is a broad scale to say. It kind of seems like more pro athletes tend to be more straight and more heterosexual, with only a few exceptions of some players here and there coming out or being like a figure of like the LGBTQ or something like that. Back then, stuff like that flew by like it was nothing. Like gladiators would attract men. Men would have what word am I trying to find? I guess men would have like prostitutes for gladiators, and they would come home to gladiators to be their bodyguards. But I mean, a bodyguard has to inspect your body per se.
And we know how that goes.
Yeah. So yeah. So I guess bringing it all together per se. Picking gladiators was very different due to the most being picked from prisoners of war or being enslaved or being punished. NFL players, however, it's your choice to be an NFL player. If you work for it, you go get it. That aspect, gladiators were forced to be in the arena. NFL players want to be in that big stage arena. Talking about arenas, actually, kind of seems like a society wraps around this idea of like the bigger the better. Like the bigger arena, like the Coliseum had a complex maze structure at the bottom to house animals, to fur fights, or to have like elephants or stuff like that underneath the stage. It kind of goes the same with how like the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which a few years ago was like groundbreaking with that collapsible and
retractable.
Retractable top to it, which is very interesting because the society wants to use the arena to bring in more ideal men, like public figures, people with bigger followings, have more say of the society, and that's kind of the way that they attract people. So I guess how is the ideal man related to politics? per se?
Let's find out. All right, so now that Danny has done such a wonderful job kind of taking us through the athletic side of things, now we're going to move to politics to see what the ideal man has looked like in politics over the years. So for an overview of, the ancient Roman perspective, because obviously we're not as well versed in that area, I'd assume, ancient Roman politicians were actually admired, or at least somewhat looked up to by most Romans and especially other citizens. The family and nation protection of those two things were seen as the most important duties for a man. And as a result, obviously politicians were incredibly important. And that led to a lot of social clout, if you will, being given to these politicians who were making these decisions. And then also people were just enthusiastic about it because it was such a big part of the culture.
And that's actually kind of surprising to me because it kind of seems like in today's world, politicians don't have that social clout that you were talking about like they used to have for like definitely the youth, and I guess more like people in their 20s and 30s who have this idea of like not caring for politicians. They stay out of the argument instead of being in this argument of like two sides bickering back and forth with each other.
Right. Whereas like again in ancient Rome, like if you were a 20-year-old kid, like your whole goal was to become a politician. If you were a citizen or child of a citizen, and we'll get more into that modern day stuff, but just for a little bit more, just to prove myself, if you will, on these claims, Pliny is a historian, a Roman historian who was pretty well read, definitely knew his stuff, and he wrote a book on natural history, or a series of books, I should say, and listed Agrippa many times as one of his, favorite Romans, I guess you could say. And he really focuses on three main areas of praise when he's talking about Agrippa, but mostly focuses on what he did as a statesman with like architecture and, his temperance with dealing with other political affairs and other, politicians and things of that nature. And then, of course, this is just one example, but there's also many other texts written by Roman historians about political figures like Caesar, and then also plenty of statues of political figures that we could still see today.
I guess with that, with Pliny, did Pliny have any of the, like, a hierarchy system of politics in his day? Like, did he rank any politics based off their, like, what they did to society, or was it viewed as, like, you're a politician, you're trustworthy, so therefore you're a good man, and, like, that deal, per se?
Definitely a good question. Obviously he didn't think that every politician was, the perfect man, or otherwise he wouldn't be able to praise Agrippa specifically so much, right? But regardless, obviously there were politicians who were looked down on, but it was generally more for, if they made bad decisions or if they seemed like a weak leader, or things of that nature. Whereas in the modern day, it seems like no matter what you do as a politician, you get much less respect than the ancient Romans did.
Yeah, it seems like in this modern day, it's not looking at what they did good, it's what they did bad. And how in this 1997 article, it showed how Americans had historically low interest in voting because they didn't really admire any side to the politics. It's more of, you're a bad guy, you're a bad guy.
Right.
Why would I vote for a bad guy type of thing.
Exactly. And granted, 1997 is, definitely a little while ago.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, 77% of people who they surveyed, of Americans who they surveyed, didn't fully trust the government to always make good decisions.
And also with that, though, in 1997, it kind of seemed like it was the start of this ideology of this bad in politics. And now it's just gotten progressively worse with, like how our former President Trump, and even with our current President Biden, each opposing side dismisses the one for what they've done good, and instead of they look back on each other's background and bash one's background into them.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And, it actually reminds me of a book I read in sociology called The Big Sort. And the book talks about how parties are so split today, the Democratic and Republican parties, that, like you said, like they won't even listen to each other, much less respect each other. So you have that divide, and then you also just have people who flat out don't care about politics at all. Like most people our age that I talk to, they say they don't care about politics, and it's actually like a point of pride to be like, oh man, that stuff's not for me. Whereas in ancient Rome, I mean, you would be seen as like an outcast if you said something like that.
Yeah, so I guess it kind of seems like the ideal man, the concept of it is a little messy per time to time, because there isn't no concrete idea of what the ideal man is. This ideal man is changing throughout time. It isn't consistent throughout cultures. And for instance, with the gladiators, gladiators were looked down upon. These athletes, these big, strong athletes, were looked down upon, and people would celebrate one's death. As in, compared to today's culture, NFL players are more role models, and with DeMar Hamlin, nobody wants to see someone die on the field like that, with a tragic death like that. And also with politics, like you were talking about, it kind of seems like back then politics were looked up to as well, like an NFL player in some sorts, and how there wasn't no bad politician. It was either you're a politician, you're a good man, you're trustworthy, that type of aspect to it. Also, there isn't nothing wrong with having personal role models, but we shouldn't expect everyone to be able to fit the same mold. So like one's ideal man could be different from another's, but who to say that one's ideal man isn't a good guy type per se.
Right. No, I think you're totally right. And I think that's a great way to, conclude our podcast today. We were just going to end with one last question, which is, can you think of any fields of work or just any areas of social life in general where the definition of the ideal man has changed?